If anybody's joined and not got the handout, please go to the JISC mail page for this mailing list and you'll be able to download the handout from the top message on that list.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Michael. Over to you.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, and thank you. I think this is the last of the series, so I think it's definitely good to say thank you very much to Hugh for organising these. It's been wonderful to attend a number of them, and I learned a lot from this series. So, thank you, and lovely to know that COVID can't stop us sort of doing textual research and collaboration. This paper is a summary of the doctoral thesis that I've fairly recently defended successfully, and will soon submit corrections for. My topic is the 4 early magisterial Pandects, that's Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Ephraemi, which I'll henceforth just refer to as the Pandects and refer to mostly by their Gregory Allen numbers. What I want to do this afternoon is introduce my methodology and then analyse a sort of select number of variants from across the canon and finish by presenting my conclusions. Why do research on the Pandects? Well, they're highly relevant both to traditional construals of what textual criticism is for and to so-called new philology. Pandect research is important for the traditional construals of the aims of textual criticism because the Pandects have traditionally been considered very reliable tradents of the initial text. So in that German quote near the top of the handout, you see Kurt Aland mockingly likening Westcott and Hort's attitude to 03 and Tischendorf's to 01 as that of Magi to the Christmas star. But are Tischendorf or Westcott and Hort right, or is Aland right to be more mocking them? Are they in fact those Christmas stars, and is there a Christ child of the initial text in the manger below? On the other hand, the Pandects are also very important for new philology, particularly 01 and 03, which many date to the 4th century. They're a particularly important source for early church history and biblical reception. They show us the beginning of Christianity after Nicaea, where a canonized New Testament and an established church were relative novelties. And that's particularly true if 01 and 03 are among the 50 Bibles which are referred to in the quote from Eusebius that's on the handout. That's not certain, indeed it's very controversial, but I've argued elsewhere that I think it's reasonably probable for 01, but I don't want to go into that now. I'm aware that actually I think it's next week, Brent Nongbury is presenting at a Zoom seminar in Leuven, arguing for a significantly later date for 01, so I intend to be there and look forward to hearing what he has to say. Moving on to my method, how I've investigated the Pandects. The singular readings method, which has been pioneered by Colwell but made famous by James Royse, has been very influential in textual scholarship, as you'll no doubt all know. Royse and Colwell argue that to understand a manuscript and its scribe, you focus on the singular readings. That's readings which occur in that manuscript only, because those readings, Royse and Colwell argue, are likely to have been influenced by the scribe of that manuscript, so they can tell you a lot about him or her. If a reading's been inherited from an exemplar, it would likely be that that exemplar would have had other descendants and the reading would turn up elsewhere in the tradition. In general, scholars have received Royce's method positively, but it's got 2 parallel weaknesses, as I note on the handout. And they're put well, I think, by Yonkind, that some scribally created readings will not be singular, and some singulars will not have been scribally created. So let me first consider the possibility of scribally created readings which are not singular. It's common sense, I think, that people do make similar mistakes. So I've taught a bit of beginner's Greek, and if 3 of my 8 beginner's Greek pupils all forget the same smooth breathing, I could draw 2 conclusions from that. I could conclude that there's a genetic relationship between these errors, and one of them is copied from the others, and they've cheated on this test. Is it not much more likely that there is no genetic relationship, but in fact they've just made they've agreed in the same error, and that beginners in Greek won't forget smooth breathings? Therefore, there are likely to be many readings in our manuscripts which are created by the scribe, but which are not singular. Equally, there are many readings that are singular today that could well have been inherited. So given the vast number of New Testament manuscripts produced and the tiny fraction that have probably survived, it's highly likely that we have in our stock of extant manuscripts. It's highly unlikely that we have in our stock of extant manuscripts the first occurrence of most readings. And there are actually a number of objective sources of evidence for this. So in his dissertation on 01, Jonkind identifies a passage, 1 Thessalonians 2, 13 and 14, where the scribe does a fairly major ditography, recopying, apparently accidentally, the equivalent of about 4 lines of text in NA 28. And fascinatingly, the scribe repeats 2 singulars in that big ditography. They repeat an omission of aletos and they change an en hemin to an en humin. And they're singular, apart from the fact that they're repeated in the ditography, which suggests that they at least were accurately copied by the scribe. It is unlikely, I suggest, that she would make the same copying error twice. And Jonkind notes a similar phenomenon in 1 Chronicles in 01. Further evidence against the assumption that all singulars are scribal and most scribally created readings will be singular is found in 2 recent doctoral theses studies by Farnes and Hickson, both of whom work on manuscripts where we either have the exemplar extant or we can reconstruct it very accurately. So Hickson found that out of 78 singular readings in his 3 manuscripts, only 23 were scribally created, so significantly less than half. And out of 129 scribally created readings, only 46 were singular. So again, going both ways to less than 50% figure. Farnes found the singular method picked up between 40 and 92% of scribally created readings. Obviously 92% is quite a lot, but 40% is a significant error margin there. So what can we do if we've problematized, or I'd argue we've problematized the singular method? Well, an alternative is to not use singulars, but to use any divergence from some published, established critical text, which is assumed to approximate the autograph. And approaches of that type are taken by Silver, by Barbara Alland, and by Kyung-Shik Min. And an obvious problem with that method is that it depends, of course, on the accuracy of this critical text, which rapidly leads to circularity. So Min and Barbara Allen use this method to test the characteristics of early papyri, and they compare it to the most recent Nestle Allen text at the time that they're working. The problem is that that text was edited by editors who took the readings of the papyri as very likely to contain initial or original readings, depending on which word you want to use, because the papyri are so early. And so this circularity emerges, that Min and Allen are using something like this as a standard for accuracy by which to measure the papyri, but actually the producers of this took the papyri enormously seriously, and that creates this circle which we see in the German quote from Min on the handout. Min argues that the close relationship between the critical text and the papyri proves them both close to the initial text. Actually, I suggest it doesn't do that. It simply proves them close to each other. They could be equally near or equally far from the initial text. Therefore, I propose a new method, which has, of course, its own problems, but it has its own unique strength as well, which avoids the problems of these other methods. For the parts of the manuscripts that I'm investigating, I look at every variation unit in NA 28 for the New Testament, or Ralph's Hanhart for the Septuagint, and every variation unit where any of the Pandects differ from any of the other Pandects, or any of them differ from NA 28 or Ralph's Hanhart. And at each of those variation units, I make my own judgments to what the initial text read, and I then assess how the Pandects differ from that initial reading. And this obviously leans heavily on my own judgments, but it's the only way to avoid the circularity of Min and Allen. And in order to ensure I avoid that circularity, I avoid giving any weight to any particular manuscripts because they're, quotes, good manuscripts. So I end up basing my decisions rather significantly on internal criteria. That doesn't mean I adopt totally thoroughgoing eclecticism. Other things being equal, older manuscripts are likely to be more likely to preserve the initial text because they're most likely to be separated from it by fewer stages of copying. That's true, other things being equal. Obviously, often other things aren't equal, but other things being equal, I suggest that what I just said is true. What I avoid doing is valuing particular manuscripts well because of a priori assumptions about their text quality. An obvious problem with the method I've just outlined is that there is no attempt to focus on researching the particular habits of the scribe of the particular manuscript. What I'm doing is attempting to show how the manuscripts I'm investigating differ from a reconstructed initial text. And that difference might have originated with the scribe of that manuscript, or it might have begun with any of the scribes of any of its ancestors, going back in a sense as far as the autograph potentially. I'm not gathering data on the habits of the actual scribe of the manuscript in question, but on the aggregate habits of all the scribes in the tradition between the initial text and the manuscript in question, which together make up the textual characteristics of the manuscript. In that sense, I find two terms that Min introduces rather helpful. Min distinguishes between a manuscript's Überlieferungsweise, or in English, its state of transmission, that is, how carefully it was copied, and its textual characteristics, its Textqualität, how its text compares to the authorial or initial text. And these two terms allow us to draw this crucial distinction between the habits of a manuscript's individual scribe and the aggregate habits of all the scribes in the line of exemplars between that manuscript and the autograph, which together create its text quality. And I'm focusing very much on textual characteristics, on Textqualität, rather than on the specific habits of the individual scribes. That's partly because Royse's method for identifying the habits of specific scribes has, as I've argued, got serious defects, but also because a manuscript surely is what it is, not just because of what makes it unique, but also because of all that it shares with its ancestors. And that's why, incidentally, I don't concern myself particularly with which scribes wrote which parts of the codices that I'm working on. Much work has been done trying to distinguish different scribes in these codices, particularly on Sinaiticus. There's quite a large literature on how many scribes this codex had, which scribes wrote which parts of it. And I value that research significantly. But I want to focus on the codex as a unity, because the scribes were clearly aiming for homogeneity. And there's a sense in which we can respect that aim by considering their work as a homogeneous unit. So what I do is I use this approach to consider sample chapters from across the Christian biblical canon. I look at Romans, John's Gospel, Revelation, Sirach and Judges to get an impression of the different textual characteristics in very different parts of the Christian canon. I see what variants from the initial text each manuscript introduces at the different variation units I described, and I categorize them in the following categories: transcriptional error, linguistic improvement, linguistic correction, start those categories again. Transcriptional error, linguistic improvement, linguistic non-improvement, harmonisation, and content change. So a linguistic improvement is an apparent correction to the grammar or the style of the initial text according to what we can know of the standards of quote, good, unquote, Attic Greek at the time. A linguistic non-improvement is something of a catch-all category for something that appears to be too linguistically regular to be a transcriptional error, but is clearly not a linguistic improvement. So a good example of that is changing a second aorist to a first aorist, which happens fairly often. I rate every judgment I make on a scale of certainty from A, which is as certain as we can be of any text critical matter, down to C, which is we really have very little certainty. I'm now going to try and demonstrate this with just one or two variants from the chapters I considered. I won't have time to go through all of the ones on the handout, but I'll pick a couple which are of interest. Let's start with Romans 8, where you have some apparatus on your handout. It's quite a well-known variant. The issue relates to whether or not there is this nominative subject, theos, inserted with the verb. Does the verse mean all things work together for good, with panta as the subject, or does it mean he works all things together for good, with an implied subject in the verb? Or is this theos actually initially there? Does the verse mean God works all things together for good? Is that initial? And the external evidence is not decisive in either direction. Many scholars, notably Metzger, Longenecker, Lietzmann, Moo, Black, and N.T. Wright, they opt for the shorter reading as initial. That's because it's obviously plausible, they suggest, that the shorter reading should give rise to the longer. Someone would add theos for clarity. The shorter reading is also probable, they argue, because sunerge rarely takes a direct object, so panta could be the subject. They also argue it's unnatural to repeat theos in the nominative only a few words after we've had it in the accusative. However, I want to suggest there are some points we can make in favour of the longer reading. So actually, the repetition of a noun in the accusative and then in the nominative soon after is not as implausible as it might seem. Paul does it in 128 in the same way, and the noun even happens to be theos. There's some textual variation there at 128, but that actually strengthens the case for the longer reading at 828, because it shows that repetition of a noun was considered problematic at 128 as well. And indeed, repetition of a noun was considered at least as problematic as a verb without a subject. So each reading is linguistically awkward in its own way, and each is equally likely to be changed. Moreover, elsewhere in Paul, an oidamen clause introducing an accepted belief or fact has generally a stated subject, so we should expect one here. Further, although sunergo rarely takes a direct object, canter very frequently functions in the New Testament, including in Paul, as something like an adverbial accusative. So the verse could mean God works in all things, or with regard to all things, or even in it, God works in every way. And this all demonstrates that the longer reading is as sort of linguistically plausible as the shorter. Can we demonstrate it might even be more plausible? Well, I think yes. Just looking at the structure of the other verses in the paragraph. So in verse 26, we got the stated subject of the Spirit. And then verse 27 has no stated nouns as the subject, but God seems to be the subject of 27a and the Spirit of 27b. So we're unclear at the end of 27 who the next subject is going to be. But in 29, it's sort of very hard to make sense of the sentence if the subject is not God, because we have this phrase, Hugh Houghton, whose son is Jesus, well, he's God's son. And 29 follows directly on from 28 because of the hottie in 29. So if 29 doesn't have a stated subject, presumably the subject is the same as in 28, and we really need a stated subject in 28. So if Paul's writing is to make much sense, we need a stated subject in 28. I suggest that to create the kind of unclarity we get in 28 without a stated subject is implausible for Paul, but to avoid repeating theos in different cases in the same sentence is the kind of, dare I say it, slightly small-minded stylistic improvement that is plausible for a later scribe. And the tradition behind 01 and 04 who don't have the repeated theos is presumably wanting to avoid that clumsy repetition. I therefore classify this variation unit as a linguistic improvement by 01 and 04, but I grade it as B to kind of reflect the fact that the arguments are quite evenly balanced. And mutatis mutandis, this method works fairly well for the New Testament books. With the Septuagint books, I don't want to go into in detail now, partly to time, partly because the sort of the Schwerpunkt of this seminar is, I suppose, the New Testament rather than the Septuagint. The Septuagint, I do something very similar, but what I consider to be the initial text is not the Hebrew Ur-text, but the Greek Ur-Übersetzung. And I argue in the thesis that for both Sirach and Judges, it is meaningful to talk about one single Ur-Übersetzung for both those books. I do want to talk about one example from Sirach. It does highlight some of the paleographic work I've been able to do. I've not done much paleographic work, but there is some sort of paleographic work in the thesis on 04. So if you look at that Sirach variant on the handout with the image of 04, 04 has been edited by Tischendorf in the 19th century, and the New Testament was edited by Robert Lyne in the 20th, but I've done my own observations using the BNF images. And as Professor Kara said at the beginning of this session, I'm enormously grateful to Professor Kara and his team in Wuppertal for their hospitality and for their help in use of the multispectral images of the New Testament. Unfortunately, we don't have multispectral images of the Septuagint in 04, but that is, is an urgent need, I suggest. And the images of 04, the non-multispectral images of the Septuagint of 04, they're tricky to read, but I've once or twice been able to notice things Tischendorf didn't notice. And actually here in that image on the handout, you see that 04 has electone with that omega. You can just see the bowl of the omega, hopefully. Whereas all the other witnesses have electu, singular. And that was something Tischendorf didn't actually note. And I submit that plural reflects the plurality of the nation of Israel and arguably emphasizes the size and the scope of God's people. So I classify that as a content change because there is some hint of a change of content there. So when I'd analysed all the variants in my chosen chapters using that method, I arrived at the results which you see in the latter part of the handout. Let me offer now a few conclusions briefly based on those results. Firstly, the Pandects do seem to alter the initial text only rarely. The figure for mean rate of change of any type per 10 verses is normally comfortably below 10.0 for most of the Pandects. In most books, there's less than one change per verse on average. Put rather bluntly and rather simply, these manuscripts may not quite be Stars of Bethlehem, but on the other hand, if you do want to access the earliest form of the text for these works of literature, they're probably not a bad place to start. The exception to that is Judges, where the Pandects have on average 38.86 variants for every 10 verses. That is because, and again I can say more about this in the Q&A, I do say more about this in the thesis, there is pretty strong external evidence for a fairly significant recension, and I do use that word even given Professor Warren's presentation. There's fairly strong external evidence for a recension of the translation between the original translation and the production of the Pandects. Moreover, what I might call the least exciting categories of variant predominate. So in every Pandect, in every biblical book, the vast majority of the changes are either transcriptional errors or they're linguistic improvements. Content changes are normally much rarer than changes of any other type. And this appears to contradict the picture painted in some popular contexts by some scholars who will argue that the fairly significant content changes were the sort of bread and butter of New Testament copyists. That question, how common were significant content changes, is of course massively loaded with ideological baggage and frequently clouded with rhetoric. But once the rhetoric is turned down, I suspect most scholars of a variety of positions would agree with a kind of moderate position which my research supports, which is that we can certainly observe theological changes, but they're relatively rare compared to other kinds of changes. And they're normally easily recognizable, and we can normally work out fairly easily what the initial reading was. And it's interesting that most scholars who argue for the significance of scribal theological changes, such as Ehrman and Heinz-Eitzen, those scholars tend not to claim that those changes were frequent so much as that they were important. My research is consistent with that those theological changes were infrequent, but they were important when they happened. And this all varies to some extent with the different books of the canon. So Romans and Sirach have fewer variants of any type. John and Revelation have more. Judges has very many. But let me think now about how the Pandects differ in different books of the canon. So it's interesting that for most books of the canon, apart from Sirach, there are one or two Pandects that preserve the initial text better than others, that are closer to being those Bethlehem stars. So 1 and 04 are the most, in a sense, reliable tradents in Romans, 03 and 04 in John, 02 and 04 in Revelation. In Sirach, they're more even, and in Judges, they're all fairly far from the initial translation, though 01 and 03 are significantly farther than 02. However, overall, the differences between the books of the canon is generally greater than the differences between the Pandects. And that's often not recognized in the literature. So, for example, it's often said in the literature that 02 is a much better tradent in Revelation than it is in the Gospels. And that's true in as much that 02 is one of the most reliable tradents of Revelation, but lags behind 03 and 04 in the Gospels. However, in my results, 02 actually averaged 7.92 variations per 10 verses in Revelation and 7.58 in John. So they're actually quite similar. 04 is the most internally homogeneous of the Pandects in terms of textual characteristics, and it's generally one of the most reliable tradents in every book. Let me finally, and very briefly now, make some remarks on what we might call new philology, on how the Pandects speak, how the textual characteristics of the Pandects speak to them in their own time, rather than necessarily their evidence from an earlier initial text. Well, the Pandects bring together a very diverse corpus of texts whose diversity of textual characteristics reflects their diversity of content. The textual characteristics of each of the different books within the Pandects are very different, and yet the Pandects unify them. So the Pandects reflect in textual characteristics what's going on at the level of content. The Pandects are creating bibliographic unity out of textual and even theological diversity. To unite the New Testament and the Septuagint is to say that the New Testament is the theological answer to the Jewish scriptures, which is one of the most profound theological and hermeneutical moves in Christian history. and the Pandects are enacting it at the level of textual characteristics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I unmute all of us to applaud you. So we continue with the same procedure for questions as before. If you'd like to raise your hand or indicate in the chat function that you have an observation or the question to ask Michael after that, another wide-ranging paper. Christina has found a typo, but I don't think that's
no, that's not a typo. That's a translation error, which is quite significant. Thank you so much. That's really important. I'll make sure that I'll check that I've not. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, Christina. Thank you. And that is actually, that's not important to my argument, but it's important to some of my rhetoric. Thank you very much. No. Thank you, Christina. This is really helpful. My German external examiner didn't notice that, but thank you for noticing it.
No, sorry.
No, thank you so much, Christina. Thank you. It's actually really helpful.
I was wondering why you talked about Christmas, and then I Googled it. Also learning something about German, actually, but I'm sorry. I mean, it has nothing really to do with it.
Is Nativitate just not a German word? Have I completely made that up?
No, it is apparently for now, but it's used in astrology these days to talk about there's a constellation of stars. So, no, but yeah.
No,
actually,
thank you. That's really helpful.
No, well then, sorry not to have a more intriguing question. Or
no, that is really helpful. As I say, it's not important to my content and my argument, but it is important occasionally to my rhetoric and presentation, so I'll get it right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Martin Curra, did you have something you wanted to say? Martin, you're unmuted.
One moment. My microphone is on, yeah?
Yeah.
I was deliberating, yeah, since, what are the characteristics of the Pandects, yeah? If I follow you, then the main interest of the Pandects is to give the best available text. And you are saying that perhaps we have some special characteristics of C. Can I ask you what are perhaps these special characteristics of C, since I'm especially interested in Codex C, also 04?
Thank you. I think a couple of things that I'd like to say, if I may. Firstly, is I'm not saying that the kind of, as it were, old philological use of the Pandects is more important than the new philological use. As I'm not saying there, and reliable is a very problematic word because you're reliable to do what? Like reliable aiming at what? But let's assume for a moment that we want to aim at reconstructing the earliest form of the text, which you can call the autograph if you like. Let's assume that's a good and a valuable thing to do, and many of us think that it is, though there will be arguments for saying it isn't. But let's assume that it is. If you do want to do that, I think my research demonstrates that the Pandects are a good place to start, which is arguably not controversial. I mean, arguably we knew that already, but I've produced new evidence for that, and I think new and stronger arguments for that. I've demonstrated also, I think, that CO4 is one of the most important, even of the Pandects, to that, because consistently across the canon, it seems to show the initial text regularly. So if one's aim as a textual characteristic is reconstructing the earliest form of the text or the autograph, I think the Pandects are very valuable to you, and I think that CO4 is particularly valuable. It's fascinating, I think, that CO4 is one of the least well-known, the least studied of the Pandects. I've often said that when I explain to pastors or theologians who are theologians with education in the Greek New Testament, but who are not professional textual critics, what I'm working on, the one of the four they've never heard of is CO4 Ephraimi. They've heard of all the others often, but they've never heard of CO4 Ephraimi. When I'm arguing, actually, from that old philological perspective, CO4 Ephraimi is one of the most important. The other aspect in which they're all important, all four of them are important, I think, is that they are the first manuscripts that create one bibliographic unit for the whole Christian Bible, which is very significant because it's acting out in bibliographic practice a very significant theological move, which was the creation of a single unified Christian Bible. And of course, people, ever since the writing of 2 Peter chapter 3, people have been saying that the New Testament has the status of grapher alongside the Septuagint. So in a sense, that's not a new development in the 4th or 5th century, but to enact it in bibliographic practice is a new development, and I'd argue that's significant. Does that answer your question, Professor Kauer?
Yes, I add my own observation concerning C. There is an astonishing point in Nestle-Aland 28 or 27 that is nearly unknown. The text of Revelation was reconstructed by Joseph Schmid mainly, and he preferred the Codex Alexandrinus. But if you look for the so-called Obertext, yeah, in most instances it agrees to Codex C. We have a similar agreement to Codex C, to Codex 04, as to Alexandrinus. And therefore, we looked for the variants of the Codex Ephraemi Scriptus, and we found, as you found it, there are the normal scribal errors. Also, I can't say that the Codex C is better than the other codexes for the moment in Revelation.
No, and I've not tested the whole of Revelation. I've tested some.
No.
Chapters. Yeah.
That was my matter.
Yeah. But I think it's also interesting that CO4 is kind of consistent in its text quality across the canon, which the other Pandects are not.
Yes.
Which may be consistent with the fact that it's later, and therefore there may have been time for greater kind of textual homogeneity to enter the canon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Super, thank you. I think the only other formal question I see is Jan Krantz. So we'll ask Jan for the last question, and then we'll stop the formal proceedings and continue with anybody who wishes to stay. So Jan, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for this paper and for your doctoral work as well. It's very good. I have well, it may sound like a very critical question, but you can easily diffuse it, I think. How does your method actually, what you call my method, actually differ from the critical text method? Because if I take all your decisions together, I have the New Testament according to Michael Dormandy. And that would be a virtual or even a real edition, because there is no end of making of editions of the Greek New Testament these days. How would you yourself escape circularity or the disadvantages of the critical text method? Are you intending to publish such an edition? I hope not.
Am I intending to publish the New Testament according to Michael Dormandy? No, you'll all be relieved to hear. Thank you. That's a great question. I really appreciate it. And that's an important question. My answer is, I am at least in control. And in an important sense, of course, I don't purport to be a better editor of the New Testament than Nestle-Aland and their team. What I would say is I am at least in control of my own circularity, such that what happens when Min tests the papyri against Nestle-Aland is he is testing the papyri against a standard which was itself biased in favour of the papyri because the Nestle-Aland editors thought the papyri were important. When I make my textual decisions, I am deliberately avoiding, as much as I can control my own biases, I'm deliberately avoiding bias in favour of the Pandects. So that although I may have subjectivity in my own judgments, I may make judgments which are wrong, of course, I can at least try not to be biased in favour of the Pandects. And therefore, I do avoid this situation that Min is in, where he is claiming that because NA28 and the papyri are close, they must both be equally close to the initial text. I think that doesn't follow Min's argument. I'd say that it could equally be possible they're equally far away from the initial text. So my short answer to your question is, I can't avoid my own circularity. What I can avoid is bias in favour of what I'm trying to measure, which Min, I don't think, does avoid. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm not completely happy yet, but we can discuss it later.
Yeah, no, I'd very much value any more points, Professor Krantz. Thank you. I would value discussing it later. Thank you.
Super. Well, on that note, we will finish our formal proceedings, and thank you, Michael.